So I don't take time travel for granted. And it hasn't, to me, lost its magic yet. But I want to continue to make sure I keep it in the forefront of everyone's brain. So here we are with another time travel, convincing time traveler video. Let's check it out.
Time can only move forward, or at least that's what we think. But what if the laws of physics and our understanding of reality are incomplete? What if time can be reversed and revisited? From time travel backed by science to accidental time slips, here are the 20 most convincing stories of time travelers. Number 20. Seeing Marie Antoinette in 1901, the Moberly Jourdain incident. On the 10th of August 1901, Charlotte Ann Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain visited Versailles while on a trip to France. After feeling underwhelmed by the main palace, the two women found themselves walking through the gardens to the Petit Trianon, a small chateau in the palace. It was then that strange things began to happen. As they walked, the air changed with an eerie stillness. The women began to see people dressed in strange, outdated clothing, like they had stepped out of an 18th century painting. These figures, described as more like wax figures than living beings, included a man with a repulsive, pockmarked face and a woman sketching in the garden, whom Charlotte Moberly later claimed to be Marie Antoinette herself. This claim sounds outlandish, but Charlotte and Eleanor came from reputable backgrounds. Charlotte's father, George Moberly, was the headmaster of Winchester College and later Bishop of Salisbury. In 1886, Charlotte herself became the first principal of a hall of residence for young women, St. Hugh's College in Oxford. Meanwhile, Eleanor's father was Reverend Francis Jourdain, the vicar of Ashburn in Derbyshire. She soon became the assistant of Charlotte. It was unlikely that the two ladies would fabricate such a bizarre story. In fact, the two didn't discuss what they had seen until a week later. It was only when they both confirmed what they had seen with each other that they returned to Versailles to figure out what happened. They thought that they'd simply come across an old exhibit, but no matter how many times they retraced their steps, they were never able to find the same path or the same structures. Some of the landmarks they remembered didn't exist, and the people they saw were nowhere to be found. It wasn't until a decade later in 1911 that their story was published under the title An Adventure. It quickly gained attention and, of course, skepticism. Even so, many believed that for a few moments, Charlotte and Eleanor accidentally slipped back to the 1700s when Marie Antoinette was still alive. Before we go on, like this video, smash the subscribe button and click the notification bell right now. Number 19. Couple from 1979 visits a phantom hotel from the early 1900s. In October 1979, two British couples, Len and Cynthia Gisby and Jeff and Pauline Simpson, went on a holiday trip through France. The two couples expected to have fun stories to tell after the trip, but a tale of time travel definitely wasn't one of them. As the four journeyed through the French countryside, the couples grew tired and decided to stop for the night. Luckily, they stumbled upon a quaint, old-fashioned hotel near Montélimar. Perhaps it was because of fatigue that the four didn't immediately notice the peculiar things in the hotel. For one, the hotel was bizarrely outdated. Its windows were covered with heavy shutters instead of glass panes, and the beds lacked pillows. They had only rough calico sheets, and the doors were secured by old-fashioned latches instead of modern locks. The couples also recalled dining in a room that felt more fitted to the early 1900s than one from the late 1970s. The most puzzling detail came the next morning when they were charged a mere 19 francs, a startlingly low price, even for that time.
Hey, that part I wouldn't have complained about. Man, could you imagine like today, that's the equivalent of like going back in time and gas being 10 cents or 50 cents or something like that. Fam, like I wouldn't complain at all about that part, bro. You seen inflation lately?
When they tried to ask the local gendarme for directions to the auto route, the officers didn't seem to understand the term, which added to their confusion. Despite these oddities, the couples continued their journey, albeit with a nagging feeling that something was off. On their way back to the UK, they decided to revisit the charming old hotel, but to their astonishment, it was nowhere to be found. not only had the hotel vanished, but when they developed their holiday photos, the images of the hotel were missing from the rolls. There wasn't even a trace of a damaged negative. It was as if the hotel had never existed in the first place. How could a fully functional hotel with staff and other guests disappear without a trace? Many believe that a time slip was behind the couple's bizarre experiences. Number 18. The infamous time traveler from the year 2036. On the 2nd of November in the year 2000, the turn of the century, username timetravel_0 went online. This is the story of John Titor, the most enigmatic figure that emerged from the early days of the internet. Under his username, Titor claimed to be a time traveler from the year 2036, sent back to retrieve a crucial piece of technology, a 1975 IBM 5100 computer. According to him, this computer was needed for debugging critical software systems in the future, which were threatened by a looming disaster. Titor began describing what his future looked like. According to him, the world he came from was vastly different from the early 2000s. By his account, the US was on the brink of a devastating civil war set to begin in 2004 that would eventually lead to World War III in 2015. This war, he claimed, would result in the deaths of nearly 3 billion people and leave the United States fragmented into small feudal communities. Each and every post by Titor had startling details. He provided detailed technical explanations of his time machine, a device he said was manufactured by General Electric and housed in a 1967 Chevrolet Corvette. He also referenced the Everett Wheeler model of quantum physics, claiming that his time travel had created a new time stream, which is why some of his predictions might not come true in our version of history. Titor's story was believed by many, but when the majority of his predictions didn't come true, more and more people began to doubt his authenticity. Even so, for the people who lived in the year 2000 when the internet was still relatively new, Titor's claims were believable, so much so that his name continues to persist in the field of physics and time travel to this day. Number 17.
Listen, he might have his dates off, but you can't tell me you don't wake up almost every day feeling like any moment now, we could be going to war. And it ain't gonna be good. It's gonna be so bad. Like every day you wake up, you hear something that just points to that. So maybe he got his dates a little off, but he was spot on with a few things he said that I'm like, you know what? He might be right, especially about that war and then the United States and fragments and stuff like that. What do y'all think is gonna happen if it get bad between us and Russia and China and everything? Bro.
A future raid foreseen by a newspaper reporter. In 1932, J. Bernard Hutton, a British journalist, and his photographer colleague Joachim Brandt were on assignment in Hamburg, Germany. They were tasked with documenting the construction and activity in the shipyard of Bloemen-Voss. As they conducted their work, the day took a sudden, unexpected turn. Without warning, the shipyard's routine hubbub was shattered by the sound of wailing air raid sirens. Bombers were heard in the distance, followed by the terrifying sound of bombs exploding. Buildings were hit, fires erupted, and debris flew through the air. It was an air raid. Both Hutton and Brandt ran for cover with nothing in mind but their safety. As they sought shelter, Brandt managed to take several photographs of the destruction. After the air raid subsided, they left the shipyard, shaken by what they had witnessed. However, when they returned to their office and developed the photographs, they were shocked to find that the images showed no signs of the devastation they had just experienced. The photos depicted a perfectly normal, peaceful day at the shipyard. No fires, destruction, or air raids. Confused and disturbed, Hutton and Brandt recounted their story. Of course, no one believed them. Who wouldn't deny their claim when the shipyard was perfectly fine? For years, the event remained an eerie mystery, seemingly without explanation. That is, until the 24th of July, 1943, Hamburg was subjected to a massive Allied bombing campaign known as Operation Gomorrah. The city was devastated, with much of their destruction eerily matching what Hutton and Brandt had witnessed in 1932. Strangely, the air raid they had witnessed became a reality 11 years later. Despite numerous theories and attempts to explain what happened to Hutton and Brandt that day, no definitive answers have been found. Number 16. Air Marshal Sir Robert Victor Goddard's time slip. Air Marshal Sir Robert Victor Goddard was a highly respected officer in the Royal Air Force. However, his name is recognized today for his frequent brush with the unknown and the supernatural. The year was 1935, and Goddard, a wing commander, was tasked with inspecting airfields across the United Kingdom. His mission took him to an old disused airfield near Edinburgh called Drem, which had fallen into a state of disrepair since World War I. Goddard flew over Drem, and the airfield was overgrown with weeds. Its buildings were crumbling, and there were no signs of life. He completed his inspection and continued on his way, but as he flew back to his base, he encountered a violent storm. Strong winds buffeted his biplane, and heavy rain and turbulence made flying extremely difficult. Goddard was helpless against the rain and wind and was forced to make a return flight over Drem to regain his bearings. As he approached the airfield, the storm abruptly cleared, and he was greeted with a sight that defied explanation. The once dilapidated airfield was now fully operational. The buildings were newly painted, the runways were clear and in perfect condition, and 4 aircraft were on the tarmac. Strangely, 3 of these aircraft were in a yellow livery, which was unusual for the RAF at the time, and one was a type he didn't recognize. Goddard was baffled by what he saw, but didn't dwell on it for too long. After landing safely, he told colleagues about the bizarre experience. Needless to say, they didn't believe him. However, 4 years later in 1939, Drem Airfield was indeed refurbished and reopened as a fully functional airbase. The aircraft that Goddard had seen, including the yellow planes, were now standard issue, and the entire airfield matched the scene he had witnessed during his stormy flight in 1935. For skeptics, it was a mere coincidence, but for those who trust Goddard, this experience was proof of a time slip. Number 15.
Yeah, it's kind of like he went through like a time portal. and y'all can look at me like I'm crazy, but until we figure out like things like a black hole, till we figure out what's on the other side of that, or where does that take you? Because all we think it does is just pretty much devour you, but we have no proof. Even Neil deGrasse Tyson says, like, on his deathbed, he wants to be put into a black hole so he can know. It's no way for us to know, right? So don't just completely like rule it out that he could have went through something similar to that.
A time traveler who met his older self. One of the classic questions to ask when you're trying to get to know someone, or when you genuinely don't know how else to keep the conversation going is, what is the one thing you'd tell your younger self? For everyone, this is nothing but a hypothetical, thought-provoking question. Unless, of course, you're a time traveler. In 2006, a Swedish man named Håkan Nordqvist claimed to have experienced something from a science fantasy movie. He met his future self. According to Nordqvist, the encounter happened quite unexpectedly while he was dealing with a rather mundane household issue, fixing a leak under his kitchen sink. Nordqvist claimed that he crawled under his sink to reach a tricky pipe, but instead of finding the usual plumbing, he found himself in what can only be described as a tunnel. This tunnel led him to the year 2042, where he met a 72-year-old version of himself. Nordqvist said that the two of them, his present self and his future self, spent time talking and comparing life experiences. He claimed they both had identical tattoos on their arms, which they even captured in a video. The footage, though blurry and heavily debated, shows 2 men, one younger and one older, displaying the same tattoo on their forearms. Nordqvist's story quickly gained traction online. However, skeptics were quick to point out that the video could easily have been staged, with Nordqvist enlisting the help of an older relative or using makeup and special effects to create the illusion. Even so, Nordqvist didn't insist that anyone believe his claims. According to him, he simply wanted to share his experience, leaving it up to others to decide whether to believe it or not. Number 14. The story of Sergei Ponomarenko, who fell through time into 2006. It was 2006, and the streets of Kiev, Ukraine were disturbed by a disoriented man dressed in outdated clothing and clutching an old-fashioned camera. The man, who identified himself as Sergei Ponomarenko, claimed to have been born in 1932 and was thoroughly confused by the modern world he found himself in. Sergei was approached by local authorities who claimed that the man was genuinely perplexed. He claimed he was simply on a walk in his hometown, but he somehow ended up in an unfamiliar place, or rather, an unfamiliar time. He was taken in for questioning, and his story only grew stranger. According to Sergei, the last thing he remembered was taking a photograph of an unusual object in the sky, a large disc-shaped UFO, before everything went black, and he suddenly found himself in a completely unfamiliar time. Perhaps the tipping point was when the authorities developed a film from Sergei's camera. The photographs were undeniably from the 1950s, showing typical scenes of that era in Kiev, including images of cars, buildings, and people dressed in period clothing. The camera was also confirmed to be from the 1950s, a model that would have been nearly impossible to find in modern-day Ukraine. What's strange is that Sergei's personal documents, including his identification and other paperwork, also matched records from the 1950s. However, after his brief time in 2006, Sergei Ponomarenko reportedly vanished without a trace, leaving no clues as to where or when he might have gone. Many theories have been proposed to explain Sergei's sudden appearance and disappearance. Some believe it could be a case of genuine time travel, where Sergei somehow slipped through a rift in time. Others suggest it could be a hoax, perhaps a staged event to create a modern legend. Still, some think that Sergei might have suffered from a psychological condition that caused him to believe he was from another time. Regardless of the explanation, Sergei's story is one of the most convincing time travel stories in the history of mankind. Number 13. The Stock Trader. If you suddenly acquire a superpower, you'd most likely use it for your own self-interest, or at least I would. And so, the story of this man who used his alleged time-traveling capability to get ahead in the stock market is quite believable. After all, many of us would do the same. Andrew Carlson's story began in 2003 when he was apprehended by the FBI for quite an unusual reason. He had turned an initial investment of $800 into a staggering $350 million in just 2 weeks through a series of improbably successful stock trades.
Now, see, the only difference between me and him, he made it look very, very obvious. I'd have drugged that thing out over time, you know what I mean? You can't do that in a few weeks. Come on, man, you gotta at least let it build up over time. Get you a meal here and there, and then gradually, you know, you already have the answers to the test.
That's something that's not possible unless you have insider information or doing something illicit to manipulate stocks, or you can see the future. Carlson's trades were highly suspicious because he consistently picked stocks that suddenly skyrocketed, investments that no other trader could have predicted with such accuracy. Convinced that Carlson had inside information, the authorities detained him for questioning. When questioned, Carlson reportedly claimed that he was not an insider trader, but a time traveler from the year 2256. He explained that he had traveled back in time with knowledge of future stock market movements and used this information to amass his fortune. Carlson even offered to provide historical facts about upcoming events, such as the exact date the Iraq War would start, in exchange for leniency. While this story is now largely dismissed as a hoax or a fictional story, there are still several who continue to believe in its authenticity. Number 12. When 3 boys traveled to medieval England. In 1957, 3 British Royal Navy cadets, William Lang, Michael Crowley, and Ray Baker, went on a routine orienteering exercise through the Suffolk countryside. Instead, they somehow found themselves in medieval England. The cadets were passing through the village of Kersey when they felt something was amiss. As the boys wandered the quiet streets, they noticed strange, unsettling details. The butcher shop they peered into was no ordinary place. It held rotting oxen carcasses, no modern counters to be found, and the entire village seemed abandoned. Perhaps the most striking part of their experience was the disappearance of the village's most prominent feature, St. Mary's Church. This 14th century church, with its towering spire, should have been visible from anywhere in the village, yet it was nowhere to be seen during the cadets' visit. Years later, Lang and Crowley revisited Kersey with physical researcher Andrew Mackenzie, who believed their story might be a case of retrocognition, a phenomenon where individuals inexplicably witness past events. Mackenzie's research suggested that the cadets might have seen Kersey as it was in the 1420s, a time when the village was recovering from the Black Death. and gaining wealth from the wool trade. With this, the Kersey time slip remains one of the most popular time travel stories. Number 11. A Swiss ring in a Ming Dynasty tomb. In 2008, a group of archaeologists in China unearthed a tiny mud-encrusted ring watch in the unlikeliest place, a 400-year-old Ming Dynasty tomb in Shaanxi, southern China. How could a Swiss-made ring watch, a product of 19th century Europe, have ended up in a tomb sealed and untouched since the Ming Dynasty, which ended in 1644? The watch was small, with its hands frozen at 10:06. The inscription and style suggested that it was crafted long after the Ming Dynasty had faded into history, potentially in the 19th or 20th century. Yet here it was, buried alongside a person who lived centuries earlier. Time travel or a hoax? I'll leave that for you to decide. Number 10. The Vatican's secret time-traveling machine. The Vatican might be a small nation, but it's one of the most influential and the most powerful countries in the world. It's in this place that the chronovisor was allegedly created. The chronovisor is a device that can view and even record events from the distant past. It was created by Father Francois Brune, a French priest and theologian. According to him, the chronovisor was created by a secret team of scientists and other intellectuals in the 1950s, who under the auspices of the Vatican had constructed this miraculous machine. Think of the chronovisor as a television for the past, where one can view what was happening thousands of years ago as if it was happening in real time. Bernetti claimed that with the chronovisor, he even watched some of the greatest moments in history, including the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Now, such a device existing is quite a stretch, leading to a lot of skepticism. Even so, the legend of the chronovisor persists. Number 9.
I would be a skeptic too, up until I heard the Vatican was involved. That's when I become less of a skeptic and more of a believer at that point. It's just something about the Vatican for me that makes me say, you know what, that probably doesn't exist. And they have it either there or somewhere else. But I think one day, they're going to be able to release. It's going to be kind of like the Diddy trial. And all of the stuff is going to come out about the Vatican. I'm serious, bro.
Jofar Vorin, the interdimensional traveler. In 1851, a mysterious man named Jofar Vorin appeared in the small town of Frankfurt an der Oder in Prussia. Vorin claimed to be from a land called Laxaria, a place unknown to any maps or scholars of the time, and spoke a language entirely unfamiliar to the locals. When questioned, Vorin described his homeland as part of a continent called Sacria, located far beyond the known world's oceans. His story became even more baffling when he mentioned that he was on a quest to find his long-lost brother, which had led him across vast distances that seemingly didn't exist on our planet, or rather, on our timeline. Vorin could understand and speak some German, though imperfectly, and he demonstrated a knowledge of geography. He mentioned 5 great continents: Sacria, Aflar, Astrar, Auslar, and Uplar, none of which correspond to our earthly continents. His written language bore no resemblance to any known script, but seemed to have a coherent structure and grammar, which meant he wasn't merely speaking gibberish. Many believe that Vorin was simply a lost traveler, perhaps from a small settlement with their own language. But some believe that Vorin was a traveler who journeyed through time, or perhaps a parallel universe. The concept of parallel universes wasn't widely recognized at the time, but Vorin's case eerily aligns with what we now consider possible in quantum theory and multiverse speculation. Despite efforts to uncover the truth, Jofar Vorin's fate remains a mystery. Number 8. Time travel backed by science. Sergei Krikalev, often referred to as the last Soviet citizen, is a man who traveled in time. And this isn't merely backed by a claim. Science proves that Krikalev indeed traveled to the future. Somewhat. He experienced time dilation while orbiting our planet for 803 days. This means he's 0.02 seconds younger than other people born at the same time as him on Earth. Number 7. The Man in Times Square. One fateful night in the 1950s, a man appeared in the middle of Times Square, New York City. Despite the crowd, This man stuck out like a sore thumb due to his clothes that seemed as if they were straight out of the 19th century, complete with mutton chop sideburns, a top hat, and button shoes. This man, later identified as Rudolph Fentz, tragically met his end shortly after his sudden appearance when he was struck by a car. Naturally, an investigation followed. In his pockets, they found peculiar items: a letter dated 1876, a brass token for a beer at a saloon long out of existence, and business cards with his name, Rudolph Fentz. The items showed no signs of aging, as if they had been kept in pristine condition for decades. The detective assigned to the case, Captain Hubert V. Rim of the NYPD, tried to piece together who this man was. Rim discovered records of a man named Rudolph Fentz, who had indeed gone missing in 1876 after leaving for an evening walk. Further investigation revealed that this Fentz was the father of a man who had passed just a few years earlier, and everything seemed to match. The clothes, the age, even the missing persons report. For decades, the story of Rudolph Fentz circulated as possible evidence of time travel. Despite rising doubts, this continues to be one of the most infamous time travel stories in history. Number 6. The Man from 2030. In 2018, the internet buzzed with a bizarre tale of a man named Noah, an alleged time traveler from the year 2030, which really doesn't sound all that distant now in 2024. Noah, whose face was blurred and voice altered to protect his identity, made several intriguing claims. He predicted that Donald Trump would be re-elected in 2020. He also talked about technological advances, stating that virtual reality would become incredibly advanced, cryptocurrencies would gain more traction, and humans would reach Mars by 2028. Unfortunately, Noah turned out to be a hoax.
I wish I would have known that about cryptocurrencies, bro. I wish I'd have heard that back then. What is it now? Like 63,000 today? Come on, man. Why didn't you say that when it was back down in the teens, bro? I wish I'd have known that, bro. Oh my God, I'm beating myself up about Bitcoin.
But despite this, his claim did convince tens of thousands of people. Number 5. The complicated rules of space, time dilation. Sergei Avdeyev, a Russian cosmonaut, is one of the few humans who has technically traveled through time. Just like Sergei Krikalev, he also experienced time dilation, as described by Einstein's theory of relativity, moving at speeds of about 17,500 miles per hour while circling the Earth. Avdeyev's time and space caused him to age ever so slightly more slowly than those of us on the planet's surface. The effect of this time dilation, though incredibly minute, means that when Avdeyev returned to Earth, he had effectively traveled 0.02 seconds into the future without aging. Number 4. The House That Slips Through Time. In 1860, a man named Robert Palfrey reported seeing a grand Georgian-style mansion suddenly appear and then vanish into thin air as he walked along a lonely road near Rougham. Over the decades, multiple witnesses have reported similar encounters. A stately red brick manor house materializing out of nowhere, only to dissolve into mist moments later. This sighting remained consistent for decades. In fact, the latest sighting was back in 2007, when a couple claimed to have seen the elusive mansion while driving, only for it to vanish when they turned back for a closer look. For many, the Rougham mirage is a case of time slip, happening over and over again. Number 3. An Army of Men. On the evening of June 28, 1812, Anthony Jackson and Martin Turner were tending to cattle at Havre Park near Ripley in Yorkshire when something utterly bizarre unfolded before their eyes. They both saw an entire army of soldiers marching in eerie silence across a hilltop. The soldiers were dressed in white uniforms, led by a commanding figure in scarlet, followed by a second army in darker attire. The two groups, despite their numbers, appeared to interact peacefully before vanishing into a mist that obscured the nearby cattle. It was a short but chilling experience. Whether this is a paranormal story or that of time travel, I'll leave it up to you. Number 2. A time traveler from the year 6000. In 2018, the story of a man from the year 6000 caught the attention of many. It all started with a video of a man whose face was blurred. The man claimed that he managed to visit the future, According to this time traveler, the world in 6000 AD is unrecognizable and eerily familiar. He described a society where artificial intelligence has advanced to the point of running the world, while humans lived in what he called utopian cities, perfectly integrated with nature. He claimed that time travel became a reality in the 21st century, with the government secretly conducting experiments long before it was made public. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence he offered was a photograph, allegedly taken in the year 6000, showing a city of the future. Skeptics have pointed out that the photo could easily be a hoax or a manipulated image, but many chose to believe his claim. The man also talked about how the future's not set in stone. He claimed that time travel had allowed certain individuals to attempt to alter the course of history, creating a complex web of alternate timelines. This, he said, was part of the reason why he came back, to warn humanity about the potential dangers that lie ahead if certain paths are taken. With the photograph and the compelling story he presented, many became convinced that the man was a genuine time traveler. Number 1. A photo from year 5000. It seems that most time travelers from the future all have bad news for us living in the present.
I was just thinking that, bro. Because I was thinking back to the war. I was like, you know, it's nothing but doom and gloom I'm hearing. Like, no, how about somebody show up and give us, some good news? Everybody gonna be wealthy? Oh, man. It's gonna be no more like lower class. It's gonna be everybody's gonna be up there making money. The economy's thriving, all good, peaceful, all of that. Why we can't get some good news?
Just like the man from the year 6000, a man claiming to be a time traveler from the year 5000 also claimed that the future would be apocalyptic. According to this time traveler, the world in 5000 AD is a bleak and devastated place where humanity has been forced to adapt to a catastrophic environmental collapse. The man even had a photo that showed a dystopian place. He claimed that he was part of a top-secret experiment conducted by an unnamed government that allowed him to travel through time, and it was during one of his missions that he found himself in the year 5000, standing on what was once Los Angeles, now submerged underwater. Whether this is a hoax or reality remains unknown. I don't know about you, but these time slips sound awfully real. But what about you? Which of these stories do you think is the closest to the truth? Let me know in the comments.